Here we go. Kinesiology 223, Chapter 7. Still working on feedback reinforcement, intrinsic motivation. This is video presentation number 2 from Chapter 7. The book presents the concept that you can schedule reinforcement for your athletes or for your people on a regular basis and have almost like a predetermined schedule for reinforcement. And I would challenge and push back on this because sometimes in a coached environment, you'll have these moments where your athletes or your physical therapy client will just have this epiphany, whether it's a kinesthetic epiphany and their body understands that they have a new component in their leg because they had a knee replacement, and it's taken them a little bit of a learning curve to understand how to function and operate with that new component. Or you have an athlete in a coached environment who puts together some of the skills you've been teaching them, and they are able to then demonstrate and then basically be able to be more effective in a game-like environment or a practice-like environment. So sometimes it's very much organically based, and you have to have the ability to reward those things right in the moment, even though it's off schedule. So what they're suggesting though is in the early stages of like a skill development where you're working with an athlete to try to teach them a skill, you have to be very proactive, and you want to reinforce behavior often and do it on a regular basis and really reinforce the good in movement patterns and try to get the desired response out of your athletes. Take some practice. You might feel like you're overdoing it at first, but you'll still have some negative feedback in there as well, right? So you're going to have some positive reinforcement, some negative reinforcement. So you got to understand, even though we're saying like reinforcement over and over and over, there is going to be an ebb and flow of positive and negative, to maybe like that 2-to-1 or 5-to-1 ratio like we talked about earlier. So let's jump into this now. When we talk about the frequency of it, they talk about having this continuous feedback is great on the front end, and it provides, the person who's learning a skill the information they need to be able to refine movement. In essence, what you're doing is you're pointing your athletes in a direction saying, I want you to do that skill out on the horizon, and you're giving them the basics, and you put guardrails up for them. And those guardrails are positive, negative, positive, negative. That's your reinforcement on either side to try to guide them on that path down towards that long-term kind of goal. And what happens is as your athlete or your patient becomes more and more proficient, task proficient at the skill that you have them doing, you need not have the same degree of frequency in terms of reinforcing the behavior. Now, I will say this, when you start working with athletes, you have this foundational part of the movement or foundational part of the process where you're teaching these basic skills, and these basic skills in essence should be part of a much bigger continuum of movement. When you're teaching running technique or power cleans, you're not teaching a power clean first or running first. You're teaching little subcomponents. As I mentioned before, it's called whole part whole. And by teaching one particular skill, it translates into another. JP, I want you to do this in this ladder drill. When I was at University of Arizona, I want you to do this in this ladder drill because it'll reinforce the footwork. So when you do your release step, then we can apply that to another drill. And JP was like, yep, I got it, because he had such high kinesthetic awareness and such a high athletic IQ. Long story short, you have these reinforcements that are used in the process more so early on. And as you now get into transferring the skill from perhaps a basic skill to a more advanced skill, you can still speak to the basics. You use that to help reinforce the very thing that you're using as your base in the more advanced skill, but you're going to spend more time reinforcing the advanced skill that you're teaching now as opposed to all the base stuff you did before. It's a mouthful, isn't it? So from a coaching standpoint, really what you're looking at is a higher degree of reinforcement on the front end for a particular skill. And in theory, if we carried that skill into a more advanced movement pattern, you would have less focus on the original skill and more focus on the new movement pattern. With you still need some reinforcement on that original skill so you can constantly reinforce and refine. And that's what ends up happening. It becomes more of like a refinement of skill as opposed to just reinforcing. Now, when you look at it, you go, okay, rewarding for the appropriate behaviors. You want to reward successful approximations, which I think is a wonderful way to describe, like, getting close and almost being there, because that's kind of like that guardrail mentality where you're keeping your athletes pointed in the right direction and you're letting them deviate a little bit And that there's a process to that and there's a purpose to that. You reward the performance, but not the actual outcome itself. You reward the effort and you reward emotional and social skills. So we talk about approximations. What's great about rewarding for approximations is this. When I tell you, okay, JP, that was awesome what you did in that ladder. You applied the skill fairly well, but you could see when you were transitioning from the in the ladder to your release step on that first step outside of a ladder, there was a little bit of a hesitation there. It looked like you were more like a thinking athlete as opposed to a doing athlete. Let's go ahead. I mean, you're close. Don't get me wrong. You're darn close. Let's try that skill again. But this time, let's not think about it. Let's just do it. Let's be a doing athlete because thinking athletes are slow athletes. I guarantee JP would have been able to do that without a problem. But that's an example of how, you kind of mold and direct your athletes and you reward them for doing something good. You're darn close to perfecting a skill, but we need to do a little bit of refinement, a little bit of work. So you're keeping them on task, you're keeping them on target, and you're keeping them within those guardrails, but you're offering the feedback to allow them to not only change a behavior that is not desirable, but also you're using that feedback to reinforce the behavior that is desirable. So you get close in your movement patterns, you can use different types of delivery to help reinforce different things. Now, if we go ahead and take this into reward performance, not only outcome, and oh my God, how many times do parents and coaches, especially youth coaches, they focus on the outcome, they focus on the win, they focus on the end skill. And, quite frankly, when you're working with youth athletes, you'll have a kid that you'll work with on a Tuesday and you come back to practice on Wednesday and the kid's 1.5 inches taller because he had a growth spurt overnight and he has to relearn everything that you just taught him because his body's different. So in some regards, when you're working with youth athletes, you almost have to focus on the performance side of it and not just the outcome. Now, when you're playing a game, you look at it and go, all right, in the dual goal outcome or the dual goal coach for Positive Coaching Alliance, it's of course you want to win, right? Because that's why we practice and work so hard during the week. So when we have a game event or a competitive event and we play to win. That's the reward for all the work. But we do so in the context and the spirit of we're learning, we're trying to get better, and we play with good sportsmanship and a whole nother list of bullet points that are on the positive side of the ledger. Now with parents, oftentimes they overly critique their kids when you start talking about they get done with a basketball game and they hop in the car and they had like a bad game and all of a sudden dad or mom who might have played basketball in elementary school or middle school is critiquing them on what they've done. Studies will almost universally state the same thing. Parents are better off saying when that kid gets into the car, Jimmy, I really enjoyed watching you play today. I enjoyed what you did on the court. And allow the child to be able to articulate to you maybe some of the stressors they had. Otherwise, you're doing nothing more than putting another stressor on top of your own kid by telling them how they missed a free throw or they didn't stay in their lane when they were doing a particular play or whatever it may be. Parents need to get keyed into being able to enjoy watching their kid play as opposed to coaching them, quite frankly. So the book also here elaborates on how outcome is out of control. You can play hard, you can play your best, you can dominate your opponent on the field of play, but you might still lose the game as a team. So in some regard, you have to view it in terms of you can only control what you can control. In that regard, you can only control that person you're guarding or the situation where you're guarding that person. You can't really control the person. And you can only do your best. And, you try to perform your best. And as a team, you might lose even though you've done very well. Effort. So you want to reward for effort? Absolutely. I mean, I saw a quote from one of my friends that I played, that I went to college with at UW, and he's a basketball coach in college. And he wrote a comment on Instagram. He said, it's amazing to see how years ago effort was usually greater than talent. And now talent is greater than effort. And I thought, well, that's a pretty heavy critique as a college coach. But I'm sure, you have this kind of mindset that he's fed up with where people think they're the best athletes on the planet and they don't need to plug in and put any effort into the process. I see this sometimes when I coach athletes over at Harper. They believe that they are there and they're going to earn a great scholarship for playing their sport. And it's a little bit of arrogance and a little bit of ego because they don't really know what they don't know. And they need to key into the effort side of it, because in a bigger college athletic environment, coaches love effort. Everybody's gifted, everybody's fast, everybody's athletic, but it's what you do with your talent that matters. So you have to cultivate this mindset that you have to have great effort, even more so than everybody else on the team, or more so than you can imagine, to be able to really cultivate your talent. And this holds true whether it's in a practice environment or the play environment. And it's a culture that the coaches can create and nurture along on the team. And I think also we need to recognize the fact that when you have a younger athlete and you give them a skill, they may not succeed, right? Because it's a brand new skill, it's something new, and they might have a little bit of anxiety, as we learned about in our previous chapter. But they're courageous in at least attempting to try this new skill and put in the effort. And as a coach, you need to recognize and reward that. Now, with the sidebar here, they show that performers who received effort-oriented feedback displayed better performance than those who provided the ability were provided the ability-oriented feedback, meaning you're talented. And this kind of makes sense if you start to think about it, because there's a cognitive dissonance that starts to creep into this when you start to tell people you're talented, you're great, you're talented. They rely on that, and then they meet somebody who's equally as talented but has more effort, and they just get crushed on the basketball court or on the wrestling mat or wherever it may be. So, you have to recognize the fact that talent is kind of universal, but you have to cultivate a mindset of effort to be able to really be a top-notch athlete. And I really like how they talk about this in terms of, children will have better task persistence, more task enjoyment than when they're praised for their effort as opposed to when they're praised for their ability. And really, when you look at it, effort is under the control of the athlete, which minimizes some of the stress that you see. We talked about how when something's out of control, it creates a stress environment. Whereas, when you say you're talented and you're playing against somebody, you can still say you're talented, and talented is something that you can take ownership of, but is it something you can truly control, like effort, right? One kind of is an adjective and the other one's a verb, right? So you want to be able to control what you control and control the effort and really reward for the effort in your athletes. So let's go back into this. They focus on a couple more examples. You have reward, emotional and social skills. If you have good sporting behavior, responsible judgment, other signs of self-control, they should be recognized and reinforced. And I can tell you, you can see the athlete who has a high emotional quotient. It's easier to coach. They don't have this arrogance to them. They're easier to work with. They view in the practice environment their person they're working against as a person who's going to help them make them better, even though it's competitive. But again, I can't stress this enough. I mean, this is a cultural thing that is brought about, created and implemented and reinforced by the coach through a reward structure that they put in place with their teams. That's just good coaching. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to jump out to the next video. But remember, you want to create a culture as a coach that reinforces effort and really reinforces, the ability to have your athletes have greater intrinsic motivation. So with that, guys, I'm going to sign off on this one and move on to the next presentation.